I'm pleased to welcome Dev Patnaik today to talk about his book, Wired to Care, How Companies Prosper When They Create Widespread Empathy. Dev Patnaik is a founder and principal of Jump Associates, a consulting firm that helps companies innovate. Together with his teammates, he works with visionary business leaders to identify new markets, reinvent existing categories, and define new products and services. When he's not working at Jump, Dave moonlights down the road at his alma mater, Stanford, as an adjunct professor where he teaches design research methods. In Wired to Care, Dave tells the story of how organizations of all kinds prosper when they tap into a power each of us already has, empathy, the ability to reach outside ourselves and connect with other people. When people inside a company develop a shared sense of what's going on in the world, they see new opportunities faster than their competitors, and they have the courage to take a risk on something new. Wired to Care is a compelling tale of the power that people have to see the world through each other's eyes, told with passion for the possibilities that lie ahead if leaders learn to stop worrying about their own problems and start caring about the world around them. As Dave notes, in addition to its considerable economic benefits, increasing empathy for the people you serve can have a personal impact. As well, it might just help you have a better day at work. At Google, we do measure some of these things in surveys and roundtables, so these are topics that Google cares about, and for this reason, I think a lot of the themes of this talk will be particularly pertinent to Googlers. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Thanks for having me. I want to start off with a story just to wrap our heads around what we're talking about. And we'll start with something that's actually familiar to folks at Google, or at least is in a related category to the work that you all do. Back in the late 90s, Microsoft faced a threat that they hadn't perceived before, and that were caught unawares by this. You may remember that they had spent most of the 80s and 90s pulverizing their competitors into submission, having fended off people like Apple and IBM for dominance of the desktop. And in doing so, they had finally reached a place where they felt they were in a dominant position for an extended period of time. They had even survived the onslaught of the internet, which many people said was going to put them out of business for good. And now, having done all that and gotten to a place where they were the undisputed leader on the desktop, they realized that they faced a larger threat, which was irrelevance. Because they looked around the world and they saw things like this, the Sony PlayStation 2, which was slated to come out in the year 2000. And looking at this device, they said, this is going to be big trouble for us. See, because the PlayStation 2 promised to do things that Windows could never do. It took computing off of the desktop and moved it into the living room where people were living their lives. And it promised to appeal to people who Microsoft had traditionally not appealed to in the past. Now, Sony had already done the PlayStation 1, but in their eyes, that had largely been a toy. That had been something for younger kids to play games on. This proved to be something entirely different. It would have a DVD player in it, it would be connected to the internet, and it promised to do things in the broader scope of entertainment that was far beyond just gaming. Looking at this, Microsoft knew it had to do something different. And they knew that to compete against the PlayStation 2, they would have to do things that didn't play to its strengths. Keep in mind, Microsoft is, of course, a software company, and this would require them to get into hardware. Microsoft knew everything about the office, but they didn't know that much about the home, and they didn't know that much about gaming. And particularly, they needed to appeal to an entirely different group of people than the office workers and IT administrators who had become their core customers. So looking at this, they decided to do something that was very different for Microsoft. They hired a group of largely outsiders from outside of the organization to help them develop something that would answer the PlayStation 2. And the folks that they brought in were very different from the standard Microsofties that Redmond had seen before. These folks loved video games. It was their life. And more than anything else, they loved to kick ass. They loved to play the kind of hardcore, sometimes violent, shoot-'em-up games where they could get with other people and show how I was better than you, because I could crush you, 5 other guys, and kill all the aliens too. And if there was a lot of blood and a lot of screaming, the better it was. Right? And looking at that, they said they were going to create something that was just for themselves, the kind of thing that they were passionate about. So if you were interested in the PlayStation 2, and if you wanted to live in some magical fairyland where you walked around and collected jewels and rescued fairy princesses, that was okay. That was not the console for them. They were going to create something entirely different. And so in the fall of 2001, Microsoft launched Xbox. And Xbox was a completely different approach, or at least a much more focused approach to what gaming could actually be about, something that was tailored to a very different audience than what the toys of the past had been focused on. And surprisingly, despite the fact that they had no prior competence in this area, Xbox was able to give Sony a run for its money. Xbox and its companion game Halo was a killer app of that year. Halo was sold out in the first weekend, and Xbox went on to sell 24 million units worldwide. Interestingly, this was the first console that was successful in nearly 20 years. Anyone remember what the last console was before this that was successful from American manufacturers? Atari, right. I mean, it had been a long time since Atari, and a lot of other people had tried to compete against Sony and had failed in the process. And here was a company that was actually able to do something different by approaching it in a different way. So psyched were these guys about their success that when this thing came out around the same time, when Apple launched its iPod, Microsoft said, we can do the same thing to them that we did to Sony, which is we can enter this business and we can do something more focused and better and succeed and give these guys a run for their money. You see, Apple was saying that it was really about entertainment as well, and they were selling iPods hand over fist. So Microsoft now had a formula for success. And so they took the same team, the guys who had worked on the Xbox, plus a few other folks who really understood entertainment, put them on it, gave them a similar timeline to the Xbox, gave them similar resources to the Xbox, and said, go after iPod and do to iPod what you did to Sony. And so in the fall of 2006, Microsoft released Zune. Any of you have a Zune? Show of hands around here? You know, it's amazing how few people I come across who actually have this thing. Some people even look at me and say, what's a Zune, right? It's a fascinating thing at how poorly this thing launched. The interface was horrible. The experience was clunky. One online critic said that the process of installing a Zune on my computer was about as pleasurable as having an airbag explode in my face. And looking at Zune, they said we looked at this and we said the numbers for this bore this out. Zune sold about 2 million units in the first 18 months. In that same time, Apple sold over 84 million iPods. Right? This is the industry definition of having your clock cleaned. And looking at this, we were fascinated because we said, what is the difference between Xbox and Zune? Because we're talking about the same company, often the same exact people. We're talking about similar resources and timeline and competitive position. And so we spent time examining the case and looking at the data and interviewing some of the key people who were on these development teams. And one thing stood out to us that was startlingly clear when we started talking to folks. And it came down to a question of empathy. The story we heard over and over from Microsoft developers went like this. It said that the biggest challenge when creating Zune was trying to figure out who we were building it for. You see, for Zune, it was a complete confusion. We didn't know who we were making it for. We were running off of PowerPoint and consultant research and market research reports. And with Xbox, we knew those guys. Hell, we were those guys, right? And that connection was incredibly important, and we believe one of the defining differences that helped Xbox to succeed where Zune didn't. Now, just to step back for a second, by way of introduction, I work at a place called Jump based in San Mateo, and we're a consulting firm that helps companies to innovate and grow. Companies are constantly looking for new sources of growth to grow beyond what they already do today, and that's across a wide variety of different industries. Car companies want to know what's coming after SUVs. Computer companies want to figure out how they can own digital entertainment. And cookie companies say, wow, people aren't eating junk like they used to. We really need to create things that are about health and wellness. And what can we do to actually innovate and do something great? And what they're all looking for is growth. And they're all looking for sustainable growth. The ability to say, okay, I need to grow time and time again, not just with one product cycle, but with many product cycles. And the question they have is, how do we do this sustainably over time? Where are the sources of innovation and growth that we can rely on an ongoing basis? And when you look at companies that have problems with this, that struggle with this, you hear the same things over and over, which is, we just weren't able to see that opportunity before anybody else did. Or we saw that opportunity, but we just didn't believe it, or we didn't act on it. Or, we had that product idea before our competitors did. We had it 2 years before them, but we didn't do anything about it. Or even when we launched a new product, between the time of starting the initiative and ending it, the thing somehow got watered down, and it wasn't quite what it was when it started, right? And we hear this over and over. And so companies work very hard to try and ensure that they stay great for a long period over time. Now, looking at this and trying to help and advise our clients on how they can continue to innovate and prosper in a sustained manner, our observation, having gotten the chance to work with some really great companies, is that it often comes down to three things. If you want to grow and innovate sustainably, you need to have a couple of things. You need to have a sense of empathy, a gut sense of what's going on in the world. You need to have a sense of creativity, and you need to come up with cool new ideas. And you especially need to have a sense of execution, the ability to follow through and get things done in a quick manner. And we started to write this book, Wired to Care, to be about empathy, because we noticed that that was a topic which a lot of people weren't talking about. There are many, many great books on creativity, and if you're interested in that, we can recommend several to you. There's even a great book called Execution, which I recommend, a wonderful book on how to get things done in an organization. But this issue of empathy seems to be something that is escaping many companies in the world today. See, empathy is this gut sense, this intuitive idea, and all of us know what it means on an individual level. We are all born with the ability as individuals to step outside of ourselves and walk in someone else's shoes, to intuitively get what keeps another person up at night. The question is, how can we do that on a widespread sense? What can we do to get an entire organization to have a widespread gut-level intuition for people outside of our walls? For the folks who actually use our products and services and pay for the things that ultimately fund our 401ks. And we've seen that the companies that are able to create that widespread sense of empathy are able to make decisions better, faster, and move more quickly to innovate and grow. Imagine when you have that widespread sense of empathy, when everybody in your organization knows what keeps your customers and your users up at night, you're able to do a whole lot of things that other guys can't. Imagine a place where not just marketers or R&D guys or developers know what's going on with ordinary folks, but imagine where the people in HR and legal and finance and everyone in your organization has that intuitive gut sense, so that somebody who's in accounts receivable knows that if he changes his billing policies one way, it'll delight his customers, as opposed to if he changes it another way, he'll enrage them. And that intuitive sense is something that we realize is the fundamental differentiator that we see in the world. When we look at companies that have this widespread sense of empathy, it's fascinating. We spent time going around and looking at firms that we believed had an overall sense of empathy. And one of the places we visited was Harley-Davidson. Harley-Davidson is based in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and they really have a sense of motorcycle riders and the culture of motorcycle riding. And to the extent that they are able to imbue that culture in everyone who works there, they're able to continue to be more successful. And you can see it from the minute you show up at Harley-Davidson. You can tell a lot about a company by its parking lot. And when you come to Harley-Davidson for the first time, this is the first thing you see. It's the first thing we saw when we came out to park. We saw a sign right up front, and it said, Harley-Davidson motorcycle parking only, no cages. Anybody know what a cage is? Yeah? It's a car. Right? Because if you drive a motorcycle, you think of cars as cages. Cars are the things that lock you in and inhibit your freedom and protect you from the outside world and keep you safe, but they are also the things that make you a caged animal. And so if you showed up in a cage, if you drove in from Milwaukee Airport in a rented Taurus, that's great, but parking is in the back, dude, because up front we leave parking for motorcycles. This is a company that very clearly tells people on an ongoing basis what is important to that organization. And I remember going in the first time, I had a meeting with a guy there named Mike Keefe. And Mike Keefe is a senior marketing guy at Harley, and he came out to meet me. He's a fairly big guy. He'd worked as a construction worker before, and he came out wearing, like a leather jacket and a pair of jeans, and he's a big guy, and he had gray hair, and the hair was tied in a braid that went all the way down to the back of his belt. right? And he came out and he said, Dave, how's it going? Good to see you. And I was like, ooh, this is a Harley guy. And then we went inside and we sat down and we had a conversation about marketing. We were talking about segmentations and who he focuses on and his target. But very much it was imbued by this sense about who Harley is and what Harley is all about. And that sense of who he is then connected with the outside world. You know, when I left Harley-Davidson and I went back home, I Googled Mike Keefe, my friend who I had just met there. And it was fascinating how many times his name came up, not just in Harley promotional materials, but in blogs and in chat rooms where people were talking about, you know, the fact that, oh yeah, I was out on a ride and you know what, I pitched my tent right next to Mike Keefe and we stayed up half the night talking about all the cool new things that Harley's going to do in the next year. And so the people who are the senior execs at Harley-Davidson are kind of cult heroes for the people who ride Harley-Davidson motorcycles. And the whole place inside of this organization is just kind of created as a monument to what it's like to ride a motorcycle. Parts of the Harley building just smell of leather. You know, it's this place where you walk through and people have posted up on the walls 10,000 banners and bumper stickers and photos of places they went on their last ride when they were out on their motorcycle. And there's big shields of things that they've taken from the last rider festival, and they brought it home and put it up on the walls. So there's constantly 10,000 little reminders about why this place is in business. And I wondered if they required people to ride a motorcycle before they got to Harley. I thought maybe that was the key to this. And so I remember I went up to a woman who was she was an admin, and she just seemed like an unlikely motorcycle rider. Not the typical person you would expect. She's kind of, a little old lady, she had gray hair and she's kind of short and just seemed like not the kind of big burly motorcycle rider. And I went up to her and I said, ma'am, can I ask you a question? She said, sure. And I said, do you ride a Harley-Davidson? And she said, oh, sure, I ride a hog. And I thought, wow. And I said, were you required to do that as part of joining Harley? She said, oh, no, I didn't ride a motorcycle when I got here, but, everybody else was having a lot of fun riding them, and they make it really easy for you to learn how to ride at Harley, and I just wanted to see what the fun was all about. And I think it just summed up this feeling of just kind of not regulation or restriction, but enthusiasm that is just kind of imbued throughout the organization that encourages people to be a part of Harley-Davidson and a part of the culture. So much so that over and over, people didn't talk about the folks who rode motorcycles as users. They didn't talk about them as customers or consumers. They used the term riders because, as one exec said, we are them and they are us. And so there was a blurry line between who was inside the company and who was outside the company. It wasn't employees and customers. It was just riders. And that deep intuitive connection allowed them to constantly make better decisions than they would if they were managing their entire organization by PowerPoint. We saw this at Nike as well. Nike is another great place that has imbued its organization with a sense of what they're all about. It seems like the entire place is filled with folks who have been athletes for their entire life and at some point decided that they needed to get a serious job too, and so now they work at Nike. And if you go up to Harley's campus in Beaverton, Oregon, it's a really neat place because the campus looks like a college campus with all the boring buildings removed. Like it's just a few offices and a lot of sports centers. And there's a running track that goes around the entire outside of the campus. And every building is named after a different Nike sports hero. So they have the Michael Jordan building and the Mia Hamm building and the Tiger Woods building. And inside each building, each of these centers is kind of devoted to the sport that athlete represents. So if you go inside the Mia Hamm building, it is a temple to soccer, or football as it's called in most of the world. And if you go inside, you really get a sense of what that culture of football is all about. Not just from the posters and the awards and the old jerseys of Mia Hamms that are posted on the walls, but even down to the way the building is laid out. So some companies have buildings that are named, the West Wing and the East Wing and the North Wing. Inside Nike, the wings are named after different stadiums. So they have the Wembley wing and the Maracana wing named after famous football stadiums. And if you have a cubicle in the Maracana wing, it's not, your cubicle address isn't, address M42D. They're named after famous football heroes. So you may actually have your cubicle on what's called Diego Maradona Way. And so your address is Maradona 42. And that's how you get your mail. Right? And that connection is just a simple, easy way. It's not a big thing that they do, but it's a way of reminding folks inside of Nike why this company is in business, to keep them connected to the outside world. So what we saw over and over again was that companies that had this widespread sense of empathy were able to blur the line between inside and out. They tended to think like human beings. They tended to think like their customers rather than thinking like experts in that space. And they tended to surround themselves inside of their offices with all this information about the outside world that helped to keep them connected. Interestingly, these folks were not always great at market research. But what happened was that their empathy kind of compensated, so that at Nike, everybody who worked on a running shoe was a runner themselves. So that if the market research report wasn't so good, the shoe ended up being pretty good anyway, because the people who were working on that shoe were able to make 10,000 better decisions based on their gut and based on their intuition as runners. When we talk about this idea about empathy, immediately it conjures up ideas of something that is very touchy-feely and something that's very soft. But what we found is that a sense of empathy is actually something that even very hard-driving companies can have. They can have that intuitive connection, even if they don't seem very touchy-feely. IBM is a great example of this. IBM is not a particularly lovey-dovey company by any means. It's a fairly hard-driving place. But what we saw over and over again is that IBMers across their organization seem to have a really good gut-level intuition for what keeps corporate IT managers up at night. And it wasn't just in their marketing, and it wasn't just in their design, but it was even in their accounting, and it was in their HR and their finance as well. So that everybody in the organization seemed tuned to who these corporate IT guys were, so much so that they really get B2B sales in a way that they don't get consumers, because they're so focused on these guys who actually make sure that all the servers and networks keep running. And that empathy isn't about them being necessarily sweet or lovey or nice. It's more about just saying, we have an intuitive gut sense. When you have that sense of empathy, a couple of interesting things start to happen. You see that people have really good intuition for what's going on. You're a bit able to feel the vibe of what's right before you read about it in a report, and certainly before the rest of us read about it in the Wall Street Journal. You're able to say, this is really right and true, and I'm going to take a chance on something new. So in these companies which had a high level of empathy, people were much more likely to take risks on things because they felt that they were right. And they were more likely to stick with it even when things weren't working out because they knew in their gut that something was going on. They had the courage of their convictions to stick with it. And ultimately, they had a sense of clarity about what was true and what was false in the outside world. I mean, imagine a company that actually had no windows, right? If a building has no windows, you'd find a lot of people inside arguing and holding meetings about what the weather was like. Well, just cut a hole in the wall and suddenly we're not arguing about silly things. And that's what we saw inside these organizations, is they spent less time arguing about things that are obvious to the rest of us. We have a empathometer, by which we have graded and scaled these companies, and we've done this for organizations, in fact, to help them measure the extent to which they have a widespread sense of empathy. But we've also put it up on our website at wiredtocare.com. You can see different organizations that have varying levels of empathy. And what you notice is there are some organizations that have very high empathy. Folks like Harley-Davidson and IBM, as well as places like Virgin and Patagonia. And then there's folks that are really trying to get there because they know that it's important. Very well-managed organizations like Procter & Gamble and Hewlett-Packard, who are definitely not there yet, but they're trying to get there because they know it's important. And then there's a whole bunch of folks down at the bottom who really have a lousy sense of empathy, where they really have no idea about what keeps people up at night outside of their organization. And for those folks, they seem to waste a lot of money and time on stuff that ought to be incredibly obvious. One example on here is Delta Airlines, and I have to say that I remember getting into an argument with a senior executive at Delta Airlines a number of years back. And the argument was because he really believed that air travel in America is just fine. It's really good. And all of this kind of upset that we hear is all media hype. This is stuff that the press has created, and actually people really like air travel in America. Anybody agree with you that air travel in America is just fine? Not a show of hands, at least in this site that we're looking at. It's something that ought to be totally obvious that air travel in America sucks. And so I remember arguing with this guy, and then I hung out at Delta, and I got to see what was going on. And things became clear to me. You know, Delta's headquarters is based in Atlanta, and it's right next to Hartsfield Airport. It's right up against the airport. And so they have their own kind of agreements with the airport. So when it's time for a Delta executive to take a flight, he does fly Delta Airlines, and he is most typically a he in that industry. So what happens is that when it's time for him to go, his admin calls downstairs, and there's a shuttle bus that comes up to pick him up, and when it's the right time, he goes downstairs and he gets on the shuttle bus, and the bus drives straight onto the tarmac, right onto the runway, and right over to where the planes are parked, and he goes right up next to the plane and to that, to the jetway. You know, there's that little door in the side of the jetway where your luggage sometimes goes out of. He goes right up those steps, and he goes and sits right in first class, and he has a first class experience. And so when he said that flying in America is really great, I had to agree. It was excellent for him. It sucks for the rest of us, and it's amazing that any of his peers could actually see that. In fact, Delta had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on research to prove to its own executives that people thought that there was room for improvement in the airlines. Right? Here's a company that in a tenuous time in its history was spending lots of money to prove the obvious. And they could not see the opportunities in front of their own eyes because they didn't have the same experiences as the rest of us. But it's a challenge to create this widespread sense of empathy. And it's not just about market research. It's about really more about cultural change. It's as much about HR, and it's about facilities, and it's all about the things that you can do to actually create a space that says, yeah, every single person in this organization knows what keeps ordinary people up at night. And you see it in little signs. Now, you can measure it, and you can build a metric system for it, but it's fairly obvious. You can start to see it just by visiting an organization. You know, companies reveal their empathy in the language that they use, and those of us who are interested in anthropology and psychology pay a lot of attention to the language that people use. Here's a great example of this. Now, we'll just take a little test. Take a look at this thing here. This is the flat part of a car up front, where the radio is and the air conditioning is, and the steering wheel screen, screws into this thing. Anyone know what this thing is called? What do we call this thing? Anyone? It's a dashboard. Yeah, you're right. No, you're all wrong. It's actually called an instrument panel if you're in the auto business, because they have been at it for so long and so focused on their own technical problems that they have completely different words for the same stuff than what human beings use. And that's a real problem, because language shapes how you think about the world. And when you're not even using the same words, you're bound to be thinking differently about it than the rest of us are. Anyway, it gets worse than that. Anyone know what this is? Just shout it out. It's a candy bar. No, you're wrong. It's a filled bar with inclusions, right? Like, dear God, I thought we made candy. This is one of the most human, ordinary things you would think. But no, technically it's a filled bar with inclusions. And so that industry is getting further and further away from ordinary human beings. And if you go to the website of most furniture manufacturers and you say, hey, I want to buy some more office furniture, and you search on their site and you look for things like desks and chairs, you won't find any desks and chairs at these companies, because you have to search for work surfaces and seating. Right? Because that's what that industry calls it. And so it's amazing how little by little these organizations have gotten out of step with the rest of us, and you can see it in their language. Perhaps the most disturbing terminology we've seen is definitely in organizations that are the most successful. I teach down at Stanford, so I see this happen, where really successful companies start to hire all Stanford and Harvard MBAs and people who are really quite erudite. And the more successful you are, the more successful you are at hiring the top cream of the crop of the world. And so what happens is you eventually get to a point where many of these organizations look out and say, well, I don't know who that guy is, Billy Bob in Peoria, who does this, but maybe he'll like this product. Who can tell? And we see that a lot. Food companies based in New York, where they hire Wharton and Harvard grads, who would never actually eat the pasta sauce that they make, because when they want to eat spaghetti, they go out to a fine Italian restaurant. And so when they think of the trailer trash that are eating their crap, they can't figure it out. Just do a focus group study to get the answer. This is a really bad thing. When a company actively and openly derides the people who fund their 401k, it is time to sell the stock. There's nothing else you can do. There's something that's fundamentally broken here when you're insulting the folks who are paying you money, right? And so we see that over and over again in the language the people use. So I don't think this is something that is, makes one company dark and venal versus another. I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's clearly something that is a natural outgrowth of what American business has done over the last 50 years. You see, fixing this, ought not to be a big problem, but we have done a great job of systematically beating the instincts out of people and beating that empathy and intuition out of folks. We tell people that it's not personal, it's just business. And so we ask you to leave all of your human intuition at the door when you come into these corporations. And we tell you to be as rational as possible and as fact-based as possible. And I worry that we're creating an entire generation of assistant marketing managers who believe that if they have 5 good bullets on a PowerPoint page, they understand their business. And they don't realize that their business is actually not on that PowerPoint page, but it's outside in the world, where people are actually living their lives, in their homes, where they're actually spending time with your products and services, and in all of the places where these transactions actually occur. So, how do you do this? And what can you do to create a widespread sense of empathy? What do you do to get everybody in an organization to have that gut sense so you're not having stupid conversations about things that ought to be obvious? Well, you could just hire your customers, but there's some problems with that. Number one, most companies aren't just trying to appeal to one type of person, right? They have many different kinds of folks to appeal to. So even at a place like Nike, if they just hired a bunch of runners, that wouldn't do it, because Nike has to appeal to folks around the entire globe. I mean, here's a photo of a product from Australia, and you look at this. What is that? A gardening hat? No, it's a hat worn by a cricket outfielder. And so if you don't play Australian cricket and you've never known what it's like to be in the outfield, you may not know what those folks need, and you may miss out on an entire market that Nike needs to appeal to. So it's not enough just to hire a bunch of runners. And over time, if you hire those folks, even former customers can lose touch with ordinary people. And probably the most dangerous thing about just hiring your customers is that focusing on just one group can make you can set you up to be blindsided by not seeing other opportunities beyond those folks. Even the folks at Xbox who did an excellent job of focusing on grown men who behaved like 14-year-old boys. Guys who love to kick ass and go and you're like, oh, that's me. Yeah. So here's the thing: even Xbox, who was able to tailor to folks, who love to play their games, right, were successful for only a period in time until this thing showed up, right? And then Nintendo, we proposed that we'll do something entirely different, which is we're going to appeal to the rest of the world. We're going to appeal to all the people who don't like to play video games, who like to do other things in their life, and we're actually going to expand that market. And so we've seen all sorts of really interesting behaviors with Nintendos. Nursing homes that have and retirement communities that have decided to put together bowling leagues and competitions on the Nintendo Wii as a way to build that sense of community. That's something that wasn't on the mind of our 14-year-old boys. So what can we do about it if we're not just trying to hire all of our customers? Well, the good news is that every single one of us is wired to care. We all have that ability. It's part of our brain system. And in fact, in the book, we talk about the biology and the science of what it's like, of why we have that sense of empathy. But for companies that have spent all this time trying to beat it out of us, these firms really need to work at it to make sure that it's systemic across their organizations. And so there's a lot of ways that you can do this, but broad brush, there's 3 things that folks can do, and this is just a little bit of guidance. And these are things that you can do at an organizational-wide level. These are things that you can do at a department level, and you can say your group of just 4 or 5 people, here's what we're going to do to try and improve our decision-making and improve our gut sense of the world. Number 1, make it easy for people. Don't, you get the instinct, okay, we got to start caring about ordinary folks more. Let's actually have people doing a lot of, rigorous analysis. Or you see companies who say, okay, everybody in the company has to spend 2 hours every month manning the customer service hotlines. That's nice, but it takes a lot of work, and most of us are really busy anyway. Right? And we don't have time for this. So if there's ways to actually increase empathy without creating a lot of extra work for people, that's preferable. And one of the ways that I thought was really great was up at in Portland at Intel. There were folks who were really trying to get folks to care about ordinary human beings. Many of the engineers at Intel had been so focused on the technology behind their chips, they had really gotten out of step with why people were using the chips ultimately, and they weren't using the chips, they were using the computers that the chips were in. And so they started to do all of this research, and so they made posters, they made pictures of like, here are the people who use computers which have Intel inside, and here's what they do, and here's what's important to their lives. Here's the story of a young man in China, and here's what he's trying to do, and here's the story of some girls in India, and here's what they're trying to do with our computers. And then they decided to post them up in the bathrooms. They put them inside of the stalls and in front of the urinals inside of Intel bathrooms, because they said, you're not going anywhere anyway. You might as well just read a story about what the outside world is and what's going on there. And I love it because it just makes it really easy. It's not like an extra step that anybody has to do. Number two, you can make it really experiential. PowerPoint is great for stand-up shows like this, and that's fine. But in terms of really conveying that sense of what human beings are doing and thinking, that only comes through real first-hand human contact with the real world. Smith & Hawken does a really nice job at this. Smith & Hawken, many of you will know, is a retailer. They sell gardening supplies and tools and seeds and stuff for the outdoors. And so central to Smith & Hawken's strategy is having a garden right outside their company. And so right outside the building is a place where employees are encouraged to go and take a plot and grow some flowers or grow some vegetables and have an experience about growing things that is so connected to their business. Because of that, it's kind of a 3D actual visual and physical thing, rather than just something that you read about secondhand. And finally, you can make it something that's every day. Don't turn this kind of empathy building exercise into an event, something we're going to do as an offsite. We're going to do it twice a year. We're going to bring in a lot of outside folks. Do it as something that is just natural and tied into the work that you're already doing. David Neeleman, the founder of JetBlue, had a great way of doing this, which is that every week he was on 2 flights from JetBlue at least. And so he made sure he flew JetBlue, and he made sure that he would spend time talking to the other passengers, and he'd help the flight attendants. He'd walk around with the snacks and the cookies, and he'd hand it out to people. And in doing so, he'd make sure that he was actually talking to people. So unlike that Delta executive who was surprised to know that people thought that flying sucked, David knew these things firsthand because he was experiencing it himself. And then when the passengers would get off the plane, he'd stay there with the crew and help vacuum and clean up. This is the CEO of the company, actually spending time every week, 2 flights a week, just to make sure he's actually connected to the folks who are flying his airline. Right? That kind of connection, by saying, let's make it easy, let's make it experiential, and let's make it every day, are some of the things that you can start to do to get folks out of your offices, out of conference rooms, out of meeting spaces, out into the real world, seeing what's going on with ordinary human beings, and then bringing that information back and populating it so you remind yourself about why you're in business. Particularly nowadays when times are tough, when we're looking around and there's a lot of uncertainty and it's not as easy to make money as it may have been in years past, I think we need this more and more. We need the ability to say, let's move ahead really quickly. Let's take decisions fast. Let's see opportunities before anybody else sees them. And let's do something about it before our competitors. And not just something that's wacky or cool or different, but something that's actually deeply resonant, that people actually care about and attaches to what's important to folks. If you do all that, you might actually improve your business, you might actually improve your products, you might actually have a more successful launch for the next offering that you're going to do. But there's something else you might have happen as well. And I think this is kind of the hidden payoff, but the kind of surprise benefit that companies we've worked with have seen in having this widespread sense of empathy, which is that when you have that intuition, when you have that gut sense about ordinary people, you start to see the impact that your work has on their lives. You start to see how what you do matters to folks out there in the world and why it's important to them. And I'm sure at Google you see that every day because you're quite good at being connected with folks. But it reminds me of something that happened about 10 years ago where this was, about 10 years ago, a friend of mine and I, we had both gone to Stanford, and so we knew a bunch of people who were working at these different software startups. And there was a little company on University Avenue that was having its 1-year-old anniversary party, some search company called Google. And I remember going to this party, right, and hanging out with these guys, and I was a total lunkhead because I was like, the world does not need another search engine, geez, right? And I'm talking to these guys about why they do what they do, and I was like, this search thing is just like a little window, and you just click in it, and that's it? There's nothing else? And that seemed really surprising to me. And I was talking to this guy, Sergey Brin, and he was telling us stories about why he does this. And I said, Sergey, why do you think this search thing is so damn important? And Sergey told me a story. He said, there was a guy who emailed me last month, and he said that you saved my father's life because he was having a heart attack. And I didn't know what to do. I was the only one at home, and I didn't know CPR, and my computer was on, and I went to Google and I just said CPR, and I searched, and the first thing that came up, the first thing, right, were instructions on how to do CPR. And so I just followed the instructions while I did, called 911, and then just kept doing CPR until the ambulances showed up. So thank you, you guys saved my dad's life, right? Now, over the next 10 years, there's all sorts of pressure from the outside world to do things that might increase revenues, and can't we festoon that homepage with all sorts of banners and things that would, and can't we just move that search bar to the bottom corner, and can't we, put in sponsorships and all sorts of nonsense? And so there's a tremendous pressure on companies to not keep it simple. But if you have that kind of firsthand human experience that says every day the work that you do either makes it easier for somebody or makes it harder for somebody, and oh, by the way, some guy may be having a heart attack and you might be their answer, you start to have more than just a salary or more than just a job. Hopefully you start to have a sense of mission about why you do what you do. And I think that's the hardest thing to have nowadays for people, is that sense of mission. So I think that Google's ability to stay true to why people are looking for info, sometimes in its most urgent senses, is something that, to the extent that we can stay true to that, the more that we can actually be successful. So the book is called Wired to Care. It's about how companies prosper and succeed when they create that widespread sense of empathy. Thanks for taking time to listen to my stories, and I'm happy to take any questions that you have.